This is Lecture English 385-27. Case, voice, aspect, mood, and your essay. Let's start with the essay. Now, I've already covered at the course webpage in depth what I'm looking for in this essay, but the depth of what I'm looking for may be a bit overwhelming, as we suggested when we talked about the essay briefly on Zoom. So I'm going to try to summarize the in-depth description of what I'm looking for in the essay here in shorter and more straightforward language. So, first, to figure out what you're writing about, right? Your subject can be any detail of first, any prescriptive text, that is, any text from any time that teaches or advocates to readers how English should be spoken, written, or understood. If you don't want to choose one of those, you can also choose any translation or edition of an early English text, that is, a text from pre-1500 in English. So in both of those cases, you're taking the work of generally a modern writer who is telling you how to interpret, how to understand, how to speak, or how to write English, right? That's what the editor and translator is doing, and that's what the English language guide or English language advocate is doing, right? So your job is to choose any prescriptive text or any edition and translation, any text that teaches or advocates to readers how English should be spoken or written or understood or interpreted, and write a 1,000-word critique of one particular detail of that text. You can choose any English language guide or any edition or translation of a pre-1500 English text. You are not limited to texts touched on in this class. Right? So once you've chosen your text, chosen your subject, your job is to write evaluatively, to write a critique, to make and justify a value judgment about the way the editor or translator or teacher or guide of English handles something, handles one thing. By a value judgment or a critique, I mean you're going to make an argument, a sensible, thoughtful argument about whether this thing is handled, whether this editor, translator, guide, or teacher, etc., handles the thing you're talking about in a reasonable way or a logical way, whether it is reasonable or logical, or whether it is effective, or whether it is true, whether it has a good word-to-world fit, whether it is sensible, or maybe whether it is ethical, whether it is aesthetically sound, right? All of these are value judgments, evaluative critiques that you're thinking through, anything like that. Now notice, I'm not inviting you to do all of these things. I'm not inviting you to make a broad, sweeping judgment about an entire language guide or an entire translation. I'm not inviting you to think across ethical and reasonable and logical and aesthetic critiques. I'm inviting you specifically to use your 1,000 words, you only have 1,000, to focus your efforts on one argument about one detail of one text. That is what will allow you to fully dig into the ramifications of that detail. So you might argue that something is illogical, and that might lead to an argument that it is, as a result, unethical or unaesthetic. But that's a ramification you've reached by building one thing from another in your argument, right? You've got to organize your thoughts around a singular thesis about one thing. And you're going to organize those thoughts into a 1,000-word thesis and email it to Deanna by the end of the day on Wednesday, June 23rd. Sorry for the noise, that's the way it is. An essay might argue, so I'll give you some examples of what you might argue in such an essay, right? Let's say you noticed that the way the OED has split the definition between na and no doesn't actually make sense. And indeed, there are ramifications of why it doesn't make sense and why it's ahistorical and thus partial in a way that privileges Southern English history over Northern English history, right? You're focusing in on the OED's splitting of the definition of na from no. And that's what you're writing about. That could fill 1,000 words. Or you might choose to argue that, let's say, the editor's translation of the word Ycknaweth in Wulfstan's Sermo, which we brought up in last Zoom session, isn't a logical translation. And you're going to make a 1,000-word argument about what it is and how it misses the point of the word, let's say. Another essay might argue that Noah Webster's rejection of the British spelling of honor especially as it's based on the grounds of ipse dixit, of how things really sound, isn't actually reasonable according either to the evidence given by James Brown or by the evidence internal to Noah Webster's own writing. Right. Another essay might argue that the way an EFL/ESL learning guide encourages Chinese students to shout English spellings out loud loudly is ineffective and maybe even insulting, right? Another essay might argue that the choice by advocates for AAVE or AAE to call Ebonics a language rather than a dialect, notice that's one choice of words, has complex ethical ramifications that you're going to argue about and critique in your essay. You see, in all of those cases that I've given, and I've given a bunch of examples here, you have chosen to zoom in on one particular thing and make a complex and deep but focused case about that one detail. Of course, you shouldn't choose any of the ideas I've just suggested because your job is also to be innovative. You'll notice here, so you want to come up with your own idea. Here and in the prompt, by the way, you'll see I'm taking ideas like complexity and focus, specificity, rigor, depth, stakes, innovation. These are basic criteria for good argumentative essay writing, which is theoretically a skill you've been honing as English majors, minors, and specialists for quite a while now. In this class, I can't dig too much into essay writing skills. This is not a course in essay writing skills, it's a course in the history of the English language. But I do teach a course on essay writing skills that a couple of you have taken. And if you'd like to take a brief look at the 12 criteria I cover in my course on essay writing skills and in other courses, you can find those 12 criteria and a brief description of each under the resources link at the top of my class webpage. So just click on resources at the top. This is a great opportunity for you to think critically and deeply about something related to this class, and to talk back in an intelligent way, to talk back to any old books or web pages you came across as a student trying to find the correct way to do things, or a way to talk back to the translations of early texts that seemed to too tidily modernize in a way that actually distanced you from the text. You remember Noah's comment in class about how prior readings of Middle English made them seem simple-minded in a way that they aren't really, right? You can take this in any direction you wish, and the prompt is open-ended, specifically because we are trying to assess how well and how deeply you've been thinking about the core arguments at play in our class. That is, the questions that we've been asking about correctness, about standards, about prescription, about description, about empowerment in one way or another, about fairness, word-to-world fit, and so forth. You should not, in this essay, try to shoehorn class ideas into your argument to please me or please Deanna. You should be making an argument about the subjects or the subject you've chosen that you believe to be true. And in doing so, your mastery of class ideas will come through naturally. You gotta trust that process. Don't force it, it'll show. Just use logic that is thoughtful and sophisticated enough that it comes as close to the kind of work we've been reading in World Englishes as you can manage. Don't, however, mimic the academic jargon of World Englishes. Just make a thoughtful, complex argument and a critique, that is, a critiquing argument, an evaluative argument, and choose the clearest, truest way of expressing it. You can send 1,000 words of that to Deanna by the end of Wednesday, June 23rd. And of course, as we go, you can bring any questions to office hours, mine or Deanna's, including ideas that you might have about what you'd like to write on. Keep in mind that this is only 15% of your course mark, and simply by doing it relatively coherently, by articulating any critique of either a language guide or an edition or translation, focusing on one thing, you'll pretty much be almost certain to score a 65 at minimum, right? You'll be doing the adequate level. If you do excellent work, you might get an 80 or higher on it, but the distance between a 65 and an 80 for an assignment that makes up only 15% of your course grade, that's only 2.25 points on your final grade, which isn't nothing, but it isn't something to stress too hard about. So try to think creatively about this. We're looking for not creative writing, but we're looking for creative thinking, creative critical thinking, and critique and active thinking through what these various texts that instruct you about how to interpret, understand, or speak, or write, or use English, how to think and talk back to those texts in an intelligent way. That's it. If you have any further questions about this essay, I hope I've shed light here. Just drop me an email, or ideally come to my office hours. All right. With the time that remains, I want to cover some key grammatical terms that we passed by when we last discussed Smith and Kiff's Smith and Kim's grammar chapter. I realized I started speaking really quickly on that. My apologies, I'll slow it down now. I want to cover some key grammatical terms that we passed by in Smith and Kim's grammar chapter or in other readings we've come across, but terms that, while they were only marginal before, they may become increasingly useful as we parse through Old English. So, we've already gone over case with respect to pronouns, because as we've said, present-day English, PDE, inflects pronouns for case, I, me, my. We're returning here now because Old English, OE, inflects all of its nouns for case. Now, I also mentioned briefly that present-day English, PDE, still inflects all of its nouns in the genitive case. That's how we inflect dog to dogs to make it possessive, though we still allow the syntactical of the to show possession too. So we can show possession again morphologically by changing dog to dogs, or syntactically by adding of the dog to dog. So we could say the dog's fur, or we could say as easily the hair of the dog. Remember, when you're faced with an OE genitive noun and it doesn't work to translate it with a modern apostrophe S, try translating it with an of the, or an of, or of a. So if you have dogs or dogges, hundes, try of the dog. If you have kynis or kindes, you could try of a kind. If you have weefes, you could translate it as of the woman as much as the woman's something. Early modern English retained only that genitive inflection too, right? So again, present-day English still has the same genitive inflection, the apostrophe S we'd call it. But early modern English grammarians were confused by that in their appeals to logic. Here I'm talking about this little box here. Why should nouns, they seem to have wondered, here let's zoom in. Why should nouns, let's just leave it. Why should nouns, early modern English grammarians seem to have wondered, only be changed in shape in possessive cases, right? So it doesn't, when we use a subject or object, we still leave cat the same. Why should we change it for cats, as in the cat's meow, the dog's hair? That seems like an illogical thing about the language, the early modern people thought. Some of them seem to have deduced, it must be that when we add s, apostrophe s, to a noun to make it possessive, it must logically be an enclitic reduction of his. That's what they decided. So even though English speakers have been saying the dog's fur, the dog's hair, for centuries, or in Old English more likely, the hundes haar, hundes, dogs, hounds, early modern people deduced wrongly that what's going on here is that it's a contraction of the dog his hair, or the dog his fur. So it's like we've taken the his and reduced it to an apostrophe s and attached it to dogs. That is an ahistorical hypercorrection. That is not based in the actual history of the English language, but early modern grammarians thought it was reasonable enough that they started writing things like the dog his hair, the king his speech. And from that ahistorical hypercorrection, frequent usages like the queen her crown started emerging naturally and frequently. This is what we call the his genitive. And it came up in the early modern period. You'll see it a lot in the early modern period, and then it falls away by PDE. With a similar appeal to logic regarding genitive inflections, early modern grammarians also decided, hey, it doesn't make sense that it, in its genitive form, it, should be his, though it had been so for centuries. So early modern grammarians introduced its, and that, a prescriptive change from above, changing how pronouns were used. It had been it, his. It had been that for centuries. They changed it to what they thought it ought to be, and it stuck. Remember, before 1100, it's not only pronouns that are inflected for case, right? We're talking about pronouns mainly here. Before the year 1100, it's not only pronouns that are inflected for case. It's all nouns. And not only for genitive cases, but for all four cases. All right. Voice. Let's talk briefly about this. A few more inflection-related terms. These three are related to verbs. Cases about nouns, voice, aspect, and moon are about verbs. Voice is in short, the term we use to refer to whether a verb is active or passive, right? Active, and these examples are from Smith and Kim's glossary. Active, Dmitry kicked the ball. Passive, the ball was kicked by Dmitry. It's exactly the same phenomenon being described. Dmitry kicked the ball was kicked by Dmitry. Exactly the same thing is happening, but the subject and predicate are reversed across these two cases. What the Smith and Kim example makes hard to see, Dmitry kicking the ball, is that most present-day English varieties inflect our verbs when we put them into the passive. You might think, and sometimes it might be explained erroneously to you, that you form the passive by taking the active and just adding the verb to be. Dmitry kicked. The ball was kicked, right? The verb to be being was a form of the verb to be. But what this example makes hard to see is that present-day English also inflects the verb rather than just adding the verb to be to it. In this case, we add the past participle, or the participial form of kick to the verb to be. It's hard to see here because the past tense of kick, kicked, the simple past, and the participle of kick, kicked, are identical, because kick is what we would call a weak verb, or might be called now a regular verb. But let's say Dmitry threw the ball. Let's say our example sentence was Dmitry threw the ball. If we made that a passive voice construction, we wouldn't say the ball was threw by Dmitry in most present-day Englishes. We would most likely say the ball was thrown by Dmitry. Those are the three principal parts of the verb to throw. Throw, threw, Dmitry threw the ball, and thrown. That's the participle that we use to form things like the passive voice construction. Dmitry threw the ball was thrown by Dmitry. If Dmitry ate the ball, we'd say the ball was eaten by Dmitry. Eat, ate, eaten are the three principal parts of the verb to eat. If Dmitry drank the ball, we'd say Dmitry drank the ball, and in the passive voice, the ball was drunk by Dmitry. This example is starting to get a little bit worn out. This is all, the examples I've given so far are all for passive and active constructions in the past. But if Dmitry is if it's happening in the present, Dmitry throws the ball, we keep the participle for passive constructions, but we change the tense of the verb to be. So we have Dmitry throws the ball is thrown by Dmitry. I hope that makes sense. I hope that the sounds my kid is making upstairs are not distracting you too much. They are distracting me, but I'm trying to keep it alive. All right, here we go. So, moving from there to aspect. Aspect and mood are two terms that I want you to have a sense of what they mean, but you don't have to know the different aspects and moods with much depth. I just want you to have a sense of what we're referring to here. When we talk about aspect, it's just a way of fleshing out the way that verbs can refer to time, right? We have verb tense, of course, to talk about how verbs relate to time. Verb tenses can be past, present, future. But aspect adds the possibility of verbs being imperfect, perfect, simple, progressive, habitual, and others. It's not just whether they happened in the past, present, or future. It's the way in which they're happening with respect to time in all of those cases. So the example, to add to this, PDE varieties usually express aspect with syntax, with the exclusion or inclusion of auxiliaries. Remember, auxiliaries are helper words. Here we might say the verb to be in was kicked is an auxiliary. Rather than having a lexical weight, it's helping affect the construction of another verb. It's an auxiliary verb. So if we have the simple past, Dmitry kicked the ball, and we want to change its aspect to the past progressive, we would say Dmitry was kicking the ball. Right? So we've there inflected kick, and we have inflected added an auxiliary. Right? So it's past progressive. Rather than Dmitry kicked the ball, it's over. We were talking about Dmitry in the process of kicking the ball. Dmitry was kicking the ball, right? It's the past progressive. The past habitual, would be Dmitry used to kick the ball. You don't need to know all the aspect terms I'm going over so quickly. We might also call that imperfect, by the way. I only ask that you have a broad sense of what aspect is, if only to appreciate our prior conversations about how Indian Englishes, say, tend to show a salient amount of flexibility with the aspect distinctions that are more distinct in standard Englishes. Or the brief references in lectures and readings about how AAVE and Irish Englishes are remarkable for having significantly more acceptable markers of aspect, and thus, as advocates of AAVE or AAE and Irish Englishes have argued, both varieties have a much higher ability to express nuance of time, timing, and temporality than standard Englishes do. We can ask more questions, potentially, I'll just zoom out from there. We can ask more questions about that potentially by asking whether the AAE forms might be traceable to historical Irish English forms. But that is a conversation for someone like Hickey. Mood. Insert internet meme joke here. Mood is the way verbs can be changed to show the speaker's attitude toward them, usually with respect to their truth value. The most common moods in English are the indicative and the imperative. Indicative being a plain statement that the speaker assumes is true or wants you to think they assume is true, and the imperative, which is a command or instruction, right? Another class of moods, we might call these contrary to fact classes, right? Or contrary to fact moods, are grouped under terms like conditional, subjunctive, optative, etc. This is the set of moods we might call irrealis moods. There are ways we show things simply in the way we present a verb to be openly contrary to what is true, or not true yet, or possibly true. There are a lot of nuanced grammatical terms here that are often grouped under the term subjunctive. Actually, the term subjunctive is often misused. But these terms, conditional, optative, jussive, etc., all refer to cases openly contrary to fact, a wish, a possibility, a curse, etc. Suffice to say that in these cases, right, whereas indicative simply uses the verb, imperative uses the bare form of the verb by stripping down its inflection. So for the indicative, we have, I am a man. Beyonce sings that song. For the imperative, we have, be a man, right? We've uninflected I to its infinitive form. I am a man, be a man. Beyonce sings that song. Beyonce, sing that song. You see how we've taken away the inflection to make it a command or an instruction? For these contrary to fact usages, or these contrary to fact moods, we can signal it in a few ways. We can sometimes modify the verb, and we can sometimes add an auxiliary. In this case, the group of auxiliaries known as modals. Modals include might, should, can, may, must, could, and so on. Right? Consider the difference between, I'll give you an example here. Consider the difference between, I insist that my daughter learn grammar at school. Or, I insist that my daughter learns grammar at school. If I say learns, I am making an observation about what really does go on at school. Does your daughter learn grammar at school? I insist that my daughter learns grammar at school. But if I were to say, I insist that my daughter learn grammar at school, I'm not talking about what is happening. I'm making a complaint about what isn't happening, but possibly could and should be, right? So let's look at more examples of what I mean here. And again, I can mark this by inflecting the verb or de-inflecting the verb, as I did here from learns to learn. Or I can use modal auxiliaries. My daughter could learn grammar at school, right? And these are, again, contrary to fact, contrary to what is the case. So taking those examples of I am a man, Beyonce singing that song, if I wanted to take I could be a man, or if I were a rich man, or if I were a boy, Beyonce might sing that song. This was all a big build-up to a Beyonce reference to her song, If I Were a Boy, and now that I'm putting it in the lecture, it feels like a little bit overdetermined. But anyway, my point is, right, contrary to fact, possible, not yet true. Beyonce might sing that song. Beyonce could sing that song. And the reason she says, if I were a boy, rather than if I was a boy, is the same reason. She's doing something to the verb that lets you know that it is contrary to fact, or possible, or not yet true. Whew. All right. Don't worry too much about aspect and mood. I only introduce the various aspects and moods to let you know that they exist and to give you a broad sense of what they mean, because you'll see them in your, if you haven't already, in your Smith and Kim chapter on Old English, and you might spot them in Old English yourself. In fact, we've already spotted mood changes a bit in early English. Do you remember in A Talk of 10 Wives, we found the line, the devil mote him sterve. And we said we could understand that line by adding may. May the devil kill him. That's because Middle English is transitioning between Old English's tendency to show mood by inflecting the verb, that is by changing its shape, and Early Modern English's tendency to show mood by adding a modal, as in may. Middle English tends to leave its contrary to fact statements sort of hanging in the middle there, so it's hard to figure out which one is which. But the key here is that you'll see that Old English is primarily showing its grammatical changes by inflecting its verbs, and Early Modern and later is primarily showing its grammar by adding or subtracting modals or other kinds of auxiliaries, or using syntax more broadly. All right, that was a lot, but thanks.